Welcome to this edition of the Douglas County School District Growing Together podcast. We will be talking to leaders, educators, specialists, and community members about topics that matter to our students, our schools, and our community. Let's jump into this week's episode as we grow together. Welcome back to our Growing Together podcast. This week I have three special guests with me. You already know two of our special guests from their 10 Meaningful Minutes podcast. We have Erin Reagan, our district lead counselor, Lori Lacombe, and she is our Healthy Schools coordinator. And our third special guest today is Heather Berry. She is both a teacher in the district and our sustainability learning specialist. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you for having us today.
Thanks, Erica.
So we're going to take a little bit different style than we typically do, and I'm really just going to kick this right over to Lori and Erin to talk about the topic that we're going to cover and why it's important and how it came to the table.
Wonderful, thank you. So Erin, we were here I think it was 2 weeks ago, and we were brainstorming some topic ideas, and you came up with this idea of talking with our listeners about climate change and how our children, our students are reacting to it, and maybe provide some advice out to everybody on how we can handle this appropriately. So tell me a little more about how this came to be for you.
Absolutely. So I think my interest in this it comes primarily through my counselor lens. So right now we have a major push around anxiety in our schools. It seems like this is something that our kids deal with a lot. And the feedback that I'm getting from our counselors is that global warming is a major source of anxiety for our students. And so I think finding a responsible way to talk to them about this topic would be really helpful. One of the things that I've heard anecdotally is that parents don't always do a great job about engaging their students in conversations about this because I'm not sure that they know how to. Mm-hmm. And so, again, counselor bias. If we have something we're afraid to talk about, let's just figure out how to talk about it.
Oh, I love it. Well, and I have my own children who are going through this, and we've had to have a lot of conversations, so I'm hoping to learn something today as well.
Well, and that's why I feel so fortunate that we have Heather with us.
Thanks for joining us, Heather.
Oh, of course. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So Heather, tell us what's a good explanation that we can use to our community, teachers, adults, to use with children when discussing current climate change?
So with children, especially younger children, I think it's important to focus on the fact that when we talk about climate change, that climate change has been happening for thousands of years, ever since the Earth started. If we look back over history, there's been periods of time where the Earth has been completely covered in ice. There's been periods of time where it's completely ice-free. So I think that we talk so much about climate change, and kids think that this is something that's never really happened before. There definitely are some differences as far as what's happening now, but it's important for them to know that, the Earth has a lot of different cycles that it goes through, and we're not in a period where, everything's expected to be the same. So it's good for them to understand that they should expect some changes and that the change in the past has happened before. When talking to kids about climate change, I think that one thing that's really important is to just focus on some of the positives as far as some of the negatives that go along with it. Today in our media, they always sensationalize the negative. So you hear, there's been all of these Category 5 hurricanes. There's been multiple tornadoes in one day. Most recently with the Australia fires, and there's maps all over the news of showing all of Australia on fire, which really isn't necessarily the case. But if we don't talk to our kids about these events that are happening and then talk to them about kind of the aftermath, and that now the fires are not as large, and Australia gets fires every summer, they're just really big this year, then they're going to think that there's fires that are happening in Australia all the time. So we really need to make sure that we follow up with all of that information that they see on the media that gives some closure to those events, and then also talks about some of the positives of it. It can be a little bit harder, especially with Australia. There's so many negative things that are going on with it. They've had dust storms, they've had flooding after the fires, but there's also a lot of positive going on too as far as animal rescue. They're saving koala bears. There's people who are making joey pouches to help save the babies. So there really is a lot of positive. So I think that really just kind of closing the loop for letting kids know what's going on after an event so they just don't think that it's continuing on will help alleviate some of their stress.
Great. And Erin and Lori, how do you at home, what advice do you have for parents to help them deal with that stress and talk about a way that they could both have empathy and still be constructive with some of their feelings?
Well, what I would bring to the conversation with your children is really about the idea of spheres of control and what you can control, what can you not control, and what can you influence, right? And so really kind of sitting down with your children and your students and really talking about what are some things that you can actually control in this situation. Like we can actually control carpooling. And we can control our recycling efforts, and we can go plant some trees, and we can turn off our lights. So some things that we feel like can have a positive effect, like you were just talking about, what are some of the positive things that we can do to make our earth a little healthier? What do you think, Erin?
Oh, I completely agree. I think that when people are confronted with things that are outside of their control, that's a really key question to ask is, what do I have control over in this situation? And so, it might even be having a family meeting, crafting a sustainability plan that lives in your home.
Oh, I love that.
And this is kind of what we are going to do as a family. This is going to be our approach. And just maybe putting it on the fridge. It says that it's important, we have a plan, we have actionable steps, and there's something about that that's empowering.
Well, I imagine if your child or your student is feeling anxious, you can go back to that moment where we actually created this plan. Let's go back, let's go over it. We might have forgotten a few parts of it. Do we want to add anything to it? And so it seems like that would be a really good tool for when those anxious moments, like those news reports do come up, that families can go back to that. So
absolutely.
I like that idea.
I think the other thing that's really healthy in this kind of conversation is just to admit that this is scary sometimes, If your child is afraid, letting them know that, this is kind of scary. You just don't want to live in that too much. You want to pivot to a place of empowerment. And as Heather pointed out, there are a lot of really exciting things happening. There are new technologies being developed all the time. We've seen advances in solar and battery power and so this is an evolving issue, and it's evolving quickly, and I think that that's part of the thing that is a little unsettling, is that the world is changing very quickly right now.
Well, and Heather, I'm just a little curious what some of your advice for teachers would be. I love how you were talking about with the younger kids, kind of closing the loop. What about in our classrooms?
So in our classrooms, there's a lot of things that we can do to alleviate some of the really misinformation that's out there about climate change. In addition to talking about how, climate change, again, isn't a new thing, but really starting off as a science discussion and showing students, here are where the greenhouse levels are. Here's what's going on. Looking at a graph of past greenhouse levels is really telling as far as what's going on in our greenhouse, especially for our older kids. They can see where the climate has been and then see where we're at now. And we are very much at a unique point where our greenhouse emissions have pushed us to a point where we haven't really seen before. So I think that's where a lot of our anxiety comes from, is because we're so high. Our carbon dioxide levels are at 415 parts per million, which is much higher than it's been at in the atmosphere since humans have been here. So we're just not sure how much is that going to push up that temperature. So we're really in a period of uncertainty. But if students can look at the data behind it, then that helps them to look at what are we really looking at. So with my students, I always talk about what is the climate debate? Because we hear a lot of global warming is a farce, or, climate change isn't happening. Well, climate change is absolutely happening. The science proves that. Anytime you hear global warming, that tends to be more of sensationalized information about climate change, focusing on just the event that we're in right now. Whereas with climate change, it's going to be more of a comprehensive looking at, what's happened in the past and what's happening going forward. Because eventually the climate can cool down too. And I think that it's important for students to understand that. So really just starting with the science behind climate, and then having a focus on what is the science telling us and where is the science leading us, rather than getting involved in a lot of activism. I feel like as educators, one of the most important things that we can do is just give kids an understanding and help them develop those critical thinking skills to figure out what did they think is going to happen, what do they think the impacts are, what can they do to help, because there's plenty of things that they can do to help decrease global greenhouse emissions. But avoiding things like trying to make our students be activists to go out and strike against climate change, or, you've seen so many different things. There's people chaining themselves to the middle of the streets. We obviously don't want our students involved in anything like that. But I think just focusing on the science is the best thing that teachers can do. And also teachers can reach out for help too, for figuring out how to teach these things. The Office of Sustainability offers training and resources for teachers to help give the tools to help teach this, because it really is, it's in our standards. So going forward, we will have to learn how to teach climate change. And it really shouldn't be a controversial issue. So understanding why it's controversial and then teaching science from there.
Awesome.
So Heather, what resources are out there for parents? I know Erin talked about building a sustainability plan as one of those methods for helping students deal with that stress, for their children to deal with some of that stress. What kind of resources might they turn to if that was one of the things that they wanted to do?
So that's one area where it can almost be overwhelming with how many resources there are, which really is a great thing. Within our community of Douglas County, we have the Douglas County Conservation District. There's also Cherokee Ranch, where families can go and tour. We offer a lot of different events through the district, through the Office of Sustainability. We have an Earth Day community night where people can come out and celebrate different things that schools have been doing. So a lot of different resources out there. As far as developing a sustainability plan, like I said, I absolutely love that idea. And it can be as simple as having a garden, or maybe talking about pollinators. When we talk about climate change, it doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to be difficult. Anything you can do to decrease energy in your household helps decrease greenhouse emissions. Anything that you plant in your yard will help, because you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere with any plants that you have. Really anything that you can do to get outside and just encourage being outside, maybe riding your bike or carpooling. All of those things have an impact and decrease our greenhouse emissions. And it really just increases your overall health and family time too, which is why we're here, is to figure out how we can increase our wellness. So really, sustainability and wellness is just a perfect combination when we look at it that way.
Great, thank you. Erin and Lori, is there anything else that you want to add, or any ideas that you've had from our conversation today?
One thought I did have when you were talking about that, there's a great book out there called Nature's Fix, and it talks about how nature rewires your brain. And it's really for the positive. So I think if people really that struck a chord, that would be an amazing book to read or listen to for anybody.
I just really appreciate this conversation and the opportunity to reach parents or students or any listener who's interested in this topic. And Heather, we really appreciate your expertise.
Yes, thank you.
And Erica, thank you for helping to facilitate this conversation.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you guys first had the idea, and that we have the resources within our district to be able to even start to have this conversation. It really is a hot topic. It's a heavy topic, and I think that we can help support our families. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.